Hi folks, Stan flying for money. We have an update finally at last. Jeju Air flight 2216. We wanted to hop into it real quick and talk about what has just been discovered. This changes a lot of things. It is significant information. So we'll hop right into it. We know the black boxes have been pulled out for a while now, sent to the U.S., some of them because they were unable to extract the data. There were some damaged connectors. The NTSB is pretty good at that stuff. Sent it to the U.S., and then cockpit voice recorder. So flight data recorder records parameters of the aircraft. Cockpit voice recorder records the voices of the pilots aboard the aircraft. So here we go. Black boxes from crash. South Korean plane stopped recording about 4 minutes prior to disaster, officials say. That gives us a lot of information potentially about a significant electrical failure, which would explain why the gear wasn't extended and why the flaps didn't appear to be extended in the final touchdown, when the aircraft touched down on the runway and ultimately overran the runway and crashed at the end of the runway. The cause of that electrical failure could explain why they were cooking so fast. They may have not had much thrust. They would have been concerned about having enough energy to make it to the runway, and so they were flying very fast down. We'll get to that in a minute. South Korea's transport ministry said Saturday that both the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and flight data recorder, FDR, from the Boeing 737-800 had stopped working about 4 minutes prior to the crash. This is a flight data recorder from the airplane itself. They have an image of it right there. That information is important to determining the cause of crashes, although in this case, I think we already know the birds were the precipitating cause of the crash. There's not much mystery left there. And then the loss of the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder would indicate that the aircraft entered what we would call an emergency electrical state, which is a total failure of the generators that would normally power the electrical system. So 3 generators on the aircraft, there's 1 on each engine, and then 1 on the auxiliary power unit, the APU. Generally, during flight, the engine-driven generators, if you have 2 of them, are the only ones that are operating. 1 can be broken, what we'd call MEL, minimum equipment list, but if it's broken, then the APU has to function for the flight and then provide a redundant backup supply of electrical power. If you get down to 1 electrical source, 1 generator, that's considered an emergency, and you'd have to land the aircraft as soon as possible. There's no indication that that was the case on this flight. So when they hit the birds, most likely, almost certainly, they had 2 sources of generator power on the aircraft, which means that they lost both of those generators. One of the things, dual engine failure could describe a total loss of electrical power aboard the aircraft. We have pretty good video evidence that the number 2 engine, the right-hand engine, continued to function. We see it belching flames on video from the ground as the aircraft passed overhead, which would indicate a compressor stall. It would mean the aircraft was functioning but damaged. And then we see a heat bloom coming out of the exhaust. It's grainy video, but you can definitely see heat haze coming from the exhaust as the aircraft flares for touchdown. And then as it skids down the runway, we can see the number 2 thrust reverser cowling is open, and you can hear the sounds that are similar to thrust reverse, to a thrust reverser actually functioning and providing some reverse thrust. The question is, how much thrust was coming out of that engine? Probably limited. When you have compressor stalls, those are high power situations. And the response to a compressor stall is to reduce thrust until you stop having compressor stalls. So they had limited thrust capability on the aircraft engine. I said this in the previous video that I posted on this, that if you lose an engine, you lose 50% of total thrust, which is pretty obvious. It's pretty explainable, but you lose 80% of performance, which means you only have 20% of performance on a single engine, and that's because you experience a lot of drag. You experience it with form drag, just the air hitting the frame of the aircraft, and then induced drag, which is producing lift. At slower airspeeds, induced drag can be pretty high. It's drag that the wings produce in order to keep the aircraft aloft in the air. A good portion of engine thrust just goes to combating that, and then you have a portion left over which goes to performance. On 1 engine, you have about 20% of your performance that you would have under 2 engines to climb or to maintain altitude. So you don't have to reduce thrust very much on that single engine to not be able to climb the aircraft or to not be able to maintain altitude, which may have been the situation they were in. With the compressor stalls, they had to reduce thrust. They couldn't maintain thrust. And with the reduced thrust, where they got rid of the compressor stalls, they may not have had enough performance to maintain altitude. That would explain the rush to turn around and land on runway 19, which was not the desirable runway. Runway 1 was the runway they were landing on, but they made a quick turnaround to runway 19, probably the closest runway for them to get the aircraft on the ground on the runway, which they did successfully. So a flight data recorder here they talk about, which was damaged and missing a connector, was sent to the NTSB in the U.S. for analysis. The authorities in South Korea concluded they couldn't extract the data from the device due to the damage, but the NTSB apparently was able to. So it sounds like they have the data from the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. They just don't have the last 4 minutes. Odds are, and we'll hop into this over here. So this is the ADS-B data from Flight Radar 24, and it shows altitude vertical rate 2,000 feet, which is kind of what we're interested in for Jeju Air 2216. The timestamps on the bottom, it's about every 10 or 15 seconds they have the timestamps. The data points every few seconds. ADS-B sends a data packet through satellite systems, and then air traffic control can use that to keep aircraft separated from each other. Flight Radar Data 24 captures all that, records it, catalogs it, so it's from that data. You can see this is altitude, so the blue line's altitude, the yellow line is vertical rate, which would be descent or climb. Here it's a descent. You can see about 700-800 foot per minute rate of descent, which is consistent with the normal approach at a 3-degree glide path to a runway. This is a fairly smooth descent. You can see to the degree that there's some rough patches or oddities there, that probably has to do with a discrete data packet every couple of seconds that's sent via ADS-B. This is probably a fairly smooth descent. Could indicate the autopilot was on or a pilot was flying it. It's not hard to fly a 3-degree rate of descent, but this is probably smoother than this is actually showing you. If you looked at it continuously, it would look fairly smooth on the descent. Now you can see right around here something happens where you go from a normal 700-800 foot per minute rate of descent, a normal 3-degree profile, to a sudden decrease over 1,000 feet per minute. And that's about 10 seconds of over 1,000 feet per minute, which is unusual. Below 1,000 feet, you can see here that this begins at about 900 feet, and then it sort of ends at plus 1,000 foot per minute rate of descent around 600 feet. So below 1,000 feet, you're not supposed to do more than 1,000 foot per minute rate of descent. Sometimes you have to. This isn't a wild descent, but it is noticeable. So perhaps do they see a big flock of birds? Were they trying to dip underneath it? We don't know what the situation was. Maybe the autopilot was turned off here, and the pilot flying was just getting the grips of control of the aircraft. Whatever the case, by the time we get to this point, and particularly by the time we get to this point, something's happened. So this is a go-around. This is what a go-around would look like. It's about a 2,000 foot per minute differential. So you go from about a 700 foot per minute rate of descent to about a 1,700 foot per minute rate of climb. This is about an 8-second interval right here. So they began the go-around apparently, and then they were unable to maintain that climb, is what it looks like. In the Boeing architecture, it really plans between 1,000 and 2,000 foot per minute rate of climb during a go-around. That's kind of what it's programmed to do. You have a toga button. If you push that toga button twice, it'll go into max thrust, and then you'll have a higher rate of climb on the way out. But for the most part, you don't want to just go super, super, super fast in a climb, because you can break through altitudes. A lot of times you're only going to 2,000, 3,000 feet. You're going to get there very, very, very quickly and maybe go through an altitude and have a traffic event if you do that. So Boeing really plans between 1,000 and 2,000 on a normal go-around. That's right where they are. But then this decrease here indicates that they couldn't sustain that climb rate, which might be indicative of bird strikes in both engines, potentially one engine shutting down. That would be the captain's engine, the number one engine. Again, video on the approach, we don't see heat blooms coming from the number one engine. We don't see heat haze. We do see some heat haze coming from the number two engine. So it looks as though at some point the number one engine suffered an in-flight shutdown. It seems likely now that that was related to bird ingestion. There is some video that we have of the aircraft going overhead where you can see what looks like some sparks coming out of both the number one and number two engine just before we see what looks like a compressor stall in the number two engine, which is a big lick of flame. If you had an engine failure in the number one engine and then you had reduced power on the number two engine, you would start this go around, and then you would start degrading airspeed and you would lose performance and then end up kind of back here in a little bit of a descent before heading back towards something more like a single engine profile, which is not much of a climb. And if you had reduced thrust, maybe no climb at all. Maybe you're in a slight descent. From the moment that this thing sort of began to the moment that this thing sort of ended, about 20-25 seconds, from the moment they deviated from a normal profile to the moment that the ADS-B stopped receiving data on Jeju Air Flight 2216 was about 20 seconds. It looks now, given the fact that the FDR and the CVR, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, ceased giving information 4 minutes prior to landing, I think this is probably about the point in time. So if they stopped giving information because of an electrical emergency, there's a good likelihood that the ADS-B would stop transmitting information as well. So this is probably the point in time when they suffered what looks like an electrical emergency. So I've talked about this in a few earlier videos. In the 737, in electrical emergency, you lose normal flap extension and you lose normal gear extension, which is similar to a contemporary, the Airbus A320. The same thing happens. If you have a total electrical failure, you'll have backup systems. In the Airbus, it's called a RAT, a ram air turbine, drops out of the bottom of the Airbus. So this would be what it looks like with a RAT, the bottom of the aircraft, and then that's a ram air turbine that pops out. That blade gets spun by the airflow. It produces in the Airbus, it produces hydraulic power to the blue system, I believe it is, which is a backup hydraulic system. And then it also powers a small generator off of that blue system pressure. So it provides hydraulic authority to the flight controls so the pilots can continue to fly the aircraft, and then electrics as well. The Airbus is a little bit more electrical dependent because the controls are fly-by-wire than the Airbus. So it has an additional emergency electrical generator. Now, as it relates to the 737, when you go into electrical emergency, you're on the main battery. That's going to supply the power. It doesn't have a ram air turbine. That main battery will power a smaller hydraulic pump for the standby hydraulic system. That will give you hydraulic power to the flight controls, the ailerons, which allow you to bank the aircraft, the elevator, which allows you to pitch the aircraft to control altitude, and then the rudder, which allows you to maintain orientation of the aircraft through the yaw axis. So it's going to provide all of that, plus a few other systems. It does not provide hydraulic source for normal gear extension, which would be via the gear handle in the aircraft, and normal flap extension, which be via the flap handle. Now, the Airbus is a little bit simpler. It's a little bit newer aircraft, is a little bit more technologically advanced. So the crew could extend the flaps using the normal flap handle. The gear extension would be similar in the Airbus as it is to the Boeing, where you have to open up the panel, you have to pull some stuff, and then it just releases the up locks. It evacuates hydraulics from the system so the hydraulics don't keep it trapped in the up position, and then gravity does the rest. It free falls. So it'd be a very similar process in the Airbus. But this is a description of the Airbus component. You have the RAT here, electric pump, blue hydraulic system. So in electrical emergency, electrical pump stops producing power, the RAT produces power, and then that goes into the various systems. The main difference functionally, operationally, between the Airbus and the 737 is that the 737 has a switch above the captain, and it's like right there. I mean, it's directly above the captain, kind of back a little bit from the captain. There's two switches. One of them activates the alternate flap system, and the other one controls that. So there's a red guarded switch. You flip the guard up, you put it into the arm position, and the switch right next to it, you just push it down, and then it'll extend the flaps to an electrical motor for the flaps, through standby hydraulics for the leading edge flaps, the slats. It extends both of those. The slats are extended. You can't retract them after they're extended utilizing that system. And then the flaps can be extended or retracted. It takes a while. It's a slow rate. Airbus is similar, although you'd use a normal flap handle, which you use every single approach. So it makes it a little bit simpler for pilots, a little bit more normal. You just do what you do on a normal flight and it'll work. It'll just work at a slower rate. In the 737, if you're not immediately familiar with that system, and that's a type of system, the alternate flap system that pilots are trained in mostly just once in initial training. When they do the initial type rating on the aircraft, they're going to touch that switch, they're going to manipulate that switch, and then they're never probably going to touch it again. So depending upon how much experience or how many years that the pilots have in the aircraft, it may have been a couple, 3, 4, 5 years since they utilized that system. So they're not going to be thinking about that system. That could explain why the flaps weren't extended. You can also, attempt to extend via the flap handle. But unless you're paying attention to a small gauge that shows flap position in a high workload where you're trying to glide to the airport, you may not realize that you're not getting any flaps out. So one of the interesting things that we should talk about is, again, the length of time here is about 20 seconds from when this began, and about 15 or 20 seconds from the time they started the go around to the time that the recording stopped. In a go around, you say go around toga flaps 15. So you go around just telling the guy you're going around, then you push the toga button, brings the throttles up. You say flaps 15, you retract to flaps 15. The pilot monitoring does that. Then the pilot monitoring will say positive rate, gear up. They'll put the gear up. So if you have about 20 seconds from the time they initiated the go around to the time that they had the ultimate electrical failure, you would get the gear up in that period of time. You might be able to get most of the flaps up. It's hard to tell in the video as the aircraft skids by whether it has a small amount of flaps out or the flaps are totally retracted. It seems like it would have been difficult to retract the flaps all the way in that period of time, but maybe they did. Maybe they had a little bit of flaps on that landing, and it's just difficult to see because they didn't have much. When did the bird strike occur? I think it occurred probably 15 or 20 seconds before the total electrical failure. And then you have, at that point, you have engines spinning down, you have damage with the number 2 engine. It should have been able to maintain idle. If you can't maintain idle thrust on an engine, the computers that control the fuel supply to the engine will generally shut the engine down. And we can see it looks like they had at least idle thrust when they were flaring and landing and skidding, and the thrust reversers were out on the number 2 engine. So either there was some damage to the electrical system on the number 2 engine that resulted in the gradual loss of power on that side, which would explain 15 or 20 seconds that they had from the initiation of the go around to the point where they lost total electrical power from the event which preceded it, which was probably a collision with the birds, to the loss of power. Either the generator was damaged and finally failed, or it took a little while for the engine to spin down, or there was a hard electrical load on the number 2 engine that ultimately tripped that generator off. So we don't know exactly what happened, but given the sort of the intense situation here with compressor stalls, the generator is going to be, as the turbine engine accelerates and decelerates in compressor stalls, the generator is attached to that engine, and so it's going to accelerate and decelerate with the engine during those compressor stalls. And so that might explain how a generator would have tripped off. Even though the engine was running, the generator had tripped off. And then you would have to, if you could reset the generator, obviously that would be a procedure that would do you a lot of good in that situation, but a lot of things are going on. So let's talk about the pilots real quick. What errors did they make? It's looking more and more like you can't really blame the pilot. There were a couple of things that could have preserved the flight. The first was to not go around when you hit the birds. And we don't know. I mean, it's possible that they initiated the go around to attempt to avoid the birds, and then they hit the birds in the go around. If that's the case, you can't really blame them for the go around. They saw a big flock of birds. They said, go around, let's get away from these birds. And the birds just flew up into their flight path. That's a potential. If they struck the birds before they initiated the go around, of course, you can continue the landing. And if you see birds going by you, you know if they're going kind of close to your engines. You can see that. You can eyeball that from the flight deck. And if you know they're going towards the engines, you probably don't want to discontinue the approach. You may not want to do that. You could end up in the scenario which it appears that they may have ended up in, where you have a failure on one engine and then you have damage on the other engine. You may have enough thrust to continue the descent and approach to the runway, but you may not have enough thrust to go around and attempt to come into another runway. Of course, you're already configured at that point, gears down, you have the flaps configuration that you need, so you're in the proper configuration for landing. The CVR is going to probably depict some. They're going to be able to put the timing together, the air traffic control comments that the pilots made, and figure out exactly when they struck the birds. If it hits anywhere around the cockpit, you'll hear the impact sounds of birds. So they may be able to time up exactly when they hit the birds to determine whether they hit the birds before they attempted the go around or after. If they hit it before, they probably should have continued the approach. The go around was probably not a good idea. If they hit it in the go around, they were probably trying to avoid the birds, and then they didn't really do anything wrong. I don't think you can blame them or give any sort of fault to them for that. And frankly, even if they did it after they hit the birds, it's a startle event. Go arounds aren't always a bad idea. A lot of times they're good ideas. You can't really blame them for that. It's not a pilot fault issue. You just kind of wish that they'd continue the approach if that's the case. The second bit, obviously, is not extending the gear when they were circling around to runway 19 and making a very hurried approach to 19, potentially because they couldn't maintain altitude. And so they had to get it on the ground and they were trying to get to the airport, which they successfully did. It becomes apparent towards the end that they were cooking. They were going very, very, very fast. They had a lot of ground speed, which contributed to the ultimate outcomes, getting down the runway, landing a little long on the runway, skidding down the runway, not being able to slow down before they hit the concrete barrier about 200, 250 meters off the end of the runway, and then obviously blew up and killed everyone, unfortunately. But if they gotten the gear down, I mean, gears are great drag devices aboard an aircraft, and if you put the gear handle down, you know the gear is not coming down, you should know that you do have a backup gear system. Now, this is happening very, 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 very quickly. And I don't know if I was in that situation. I was going through the same event they were going through. I don't know if I would have figured it out or not. I think I would have known at a certain point. You want to maintain glide. You don't want to put the drag out until you know you've made the runway. But once it becomes apparent, I'm going really fast. I've definitely made the runway. I need to get rid of some energy. I want to get the gear down. And if the gear's not coming down manually, you know you got the backup system. That's not something that is going to be confusing to most pilots. And then at that point, as the captain, it's on the first officer side. Say, hey, open that compartment, pull those handles, get the gear down so you can get some drag down. I wouldn't have been thinking about the fact that getting the gears down also causes a flight spoiler system to work on the ground, and the speed brakes and the ground spoilers, which greatly reduce the amount of runway needed to stop. I wouldn't have been thinking about that, but it does that as well. You have braking under a hydraulic accumulator, so you're going to have brakes, and most likely you would have gotten the aircraft stopped and would have avoided this tragedy. So unfortunately, they didn't get the gear down, and unfortunately, we're never going to know why they didn't get the gear down. The last 4 minutes are gone from the CVR. We're not going to be able to answer the question. Did they just forget about it? Were they unaware of it? Or did they say gear down and they put the normal gear handle down and they just never verified that the gear was coming down and they didn't figure out that they needed to pull the alternate gear? It's possible they were late in the phase, that they wanted to keep the glide going as long as possible to make sure they were going to get the runway. And then when you're in your last 10 seconds, 15 seconds, hey, let's get the gear down. And he puts a gear handle down, they don't realize that's not going to work. And then by the time they realize that's not going to work, it's too late. They're already at the ground in the flare. So I don't know how much you can really blame them for that. This happened very, 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 very quickly. The second part of this is how much of this is a Boeing issue versus an Airbus issue. If this has been an Airbus going through the exact same situation, the Airbus 320, the Boeing 737 being very, very, very precise competitors, they're competing for the exact same market. The Airbus is a little bit newer. It's designed in the late 70s, early 80s. The 737 was designed kind of in the late 60s, going into the early 70s, but it has a lot of components that come from the 727. It was designed in the late 50s, and the overhead panel is pretty much a shrunk-down flight engineer's panel from the 727. So a lot of the architecture from a human factor standpoint comes from late 1950s technology. So we're talking about 70-year-old human factors tech. The Airbus is a little bit easier to fly as a result, but I don't know that there would have been that much of a difference if this had been an Airbus as opposed to the 737. Sure, they would have had a little bit of an easier time getting the flaps, so if they were asking for flaps extensions, again, we're not going to know whether they did that because we don't have the CVR in this case, but if they were attempting to extend the flap as they got closer to the runway, and they were doing it through the normal flap handle because it didn't strike them that they needed to use the alternate because they were in electrical emergency, and my guess is 95% of Boeing pilots would not have been thinking about that at that moment, if you're being totally honest. It's a very small percentage of Boeing pilots that would have been thinking about, hey, I'm in electrical emergency, I need to use the alternate flap extension. So then you ask for flaps, you extend flaps. There's a small gauge, you're probably not paying too much attention to it at that time because you got life and death stuff going on in front of you. So they may have been attempting to extend the flaps and just not been able to. In the Airbus, those flaps would have extended because they extend off the normal system, even though it's a standby pump that operates a system like the Boeing. The normal system, the normal flap selector will actually extend the flaps. The landing gear would be the same thing on the Airbus as it is on the 737, unless you knew in electrical emergency that you were not going to be able to use a normal extension method. You wouldn't immediately go to the manual gear extension, and so they probably would have bellied up, and if it had been an Airbus, maybe a little bit slower because the flaps would have been out. Don't know how much that would have helped. They would have bled off a little bit of airspeed, but they were going at such a rate. I mean, they could have been 60 60 knots slower going off the end of the runway, and the outcome would have probably been pretty much the same. Maybe a few additional passengers in the back of the aircraft would have survived, but it would have been a mass casualty event. That is the update we have on Jeju Air 2216. Again, a tragedy. Again, just praying for the family members, and hopefully it never happens again. That's the update that we have. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there.